If you're ready to go, everybody, if everybody's back, I'd just like to introduce Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt, who is the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, who's very kindly offered to give us a presentation around the UK perspective of dealing with the pandemic. Mr. Hewitt, over to you.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. So I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or half an hour or so talking about the response that we've undertaken in the UK to the coronavirus, and really I think that's the context in which we're operating. And as it says there, an unprecedented situation that poses an urgent threat to public health and safety, and it's put the police in a position of dealing with challenges that they've never faced before, which they're having to navigate with sensitivity and diligence. Now, I'm not one to use the word unprecedented a lot. I think it does get overused, but I do think that quote, which comes from the Home Affairs Select Committee within the UK Parliament, is accurate. And the points that I particularly want to major on as I go through and talk about how we've responded are those the last two words around sensitivity and diligence, because that's been the really important issue for me in terms of how UK policing has responded to the pandemic. So it is important to talk about the context, and this is a global pandemic, as everybody knows, but in the UK, we've had now 1.65 million people infected, and we've sadly gone over 60,000 deaths as a result of the pandemic. And what's happened as part of the legislation that the government has brought in is there have been very considerable restrictions on society and restrictions on people's freedoms to go about their normal daily lives and do the things they would normally do in a way that we have not seen in the United Kingdom, probably since some of the restrictions that were imposed during the Second World War. So this is a massive issue societally in terms of people's freedom, as much as it is obviously in terms of health. And there's also been a very, very significant impact on the economy of the United Kingdom. And also, as we got through to last summer and the period that would normally be the examination period for school children and for students at university, it became an education crisis as well, as the country looked to understand how we could maintain those processes as effectively and as legitimately as we could whilst dealing with the health crisis. And there's something about its intensity and its duration. I've dealt with a lot of critical incidents over my policing career, but with most critical incidents, you know that they will be geographically bounded. If you have flooding, for example, that will be in a particular geographic area. And it would also be bounded by time. In this country, you will know that in 3-4 weeks, the weather will change sufficiently so that you will move out of a response phase and you will move into a recovery phase. And of course, the pandemic affects every single part of the United Kingdom, and we don't know when it's actually going to be over. Now, we've got some hope now in terms of the vaccine, and today is the day that the vaccine has first been administered to people in this country. So that does provide us with some hope, but I would still project us being at least 6 months till we are at the other side and returning to whatever a new normality looks like when we come out of the other side of the pandemic. And of course, there's another really important factor for policing and every other organisation. And that factor is this, that in most crises, if you're dealing with the crises as a police officer, you are dealing with it in a professional context. You go and deal with the terrorist incident, you deal with the flooding. In this pandemic, we are all dealing with it professionally, but we are equally all dealing it in a very personal way as well. It is affecting us. It's affecting our families. It's affecting our elderly relatives. It's affecting our children. So this is genuinely unprecedented. And I think also another point that makes this one very different is the fact that it engages every department of government. Every part of the government has to play a role in managing the pandemic. And that is an unusual situation and, of course, creates considerable complications around decision making. And, of course, the other contextual point, the bottom one there about concurrent matters, is that policing is policing, and policing carries on, and we are still having to deal with other issues. And right now, if you look at the context right now, concurrently, we are in the final stages of moving towards the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union, and we still are not in a position where we understand precisely what that's going to mean for society generally, for policing particularly. We're also into a winter planning phase, where of course at this time of year we already have the normal pandemic, the flu issues in our health service. We have the issues around flooding, other kind of weather-related issues. So this is a really busy period for us. And of course, simultaneously in policing, we are still having to deal with levels of both crime and demand. And I'll talk a little bit about how those have changed over the last 9-10 months of dealing with the pandemic. But nonetheless, they remain there as a real issue. So picking up having to deal with the pandemic, one of the issues that I thought was really important was that we actually set some very clear principles at the outset about how we are going to operate. I took on the role as the Gold Commander for the UK policing response, but we thought in terms of how we engage with government, it was important for us to set some principles about what we felt we needed to operate effectively. We needed no surprises, and we have had some surprises as it's gone through because this thing has been fast-paced, but we didn't want to be in a position where we didn't know what was happening next, and I'll talk about how we've tried to manage some of that. Equity is a really important point. People's compliance with the regulations, with the guidance that isn't law but is there as guidance for people, depends around people, is about behaviour. And the behavioural science that we've been working alongside throughout has been very, very clear that one of the issues that you have to avoid is what they would describe as othering. So othering being when I feel that this is more negatively impacting on me than it is negatively impacting on somebody else. I feel disadvantaged. So we've really pushed for as much as possible to achieve equity in the way that this the policing of the pandemic was impacting on individuals and communities. Everything we do is based around our legitimacy and based around our very clear point of policing by consent. That is how we police. We police with a community policing model, and you've just seen the video earlier of the work done by the police and community support officers in Surrey. It was absolutely critical for me that we carried on policing by consent, and one of the strategic objectives that I set was that we come out of this pandemic with as good, if not better, a relationship with the public than the one that we entered the pandemic with. I was really concerned about the impact on our style of policing and our position with our communities based on the fact that we were introducing, or the government was introducing, very, very draconian regulations that impacted on people's movement. These decisions that government are taking, I accept, are based around health considerations and economic considerations. They are trying to balance the very difficult issue of what you do to prevent this disease spreading, but at the same time not wanting to fundamentally undermine the economy. And we had to accept as a service that was going to be the basis of the decision making, and then we needed to identify how policing would then respond. We've really pushed for clarity of responsibility. In other words, you can't just lump responsibilities onto policing. We are seen as a large organisation. We've got lots of capable people. We are an organisation that can get on and do things. And there was a real potential that the government would always see whenever there was an issue, well, we can go to the police because they can mobilise. And we needed to be really clear about those responsibilities. And particularly when it came to talking about enforcement, it was really important that enforcement didn't equal policing. Local authorities have enforcement powers. Licensing authorities have enforcement powers. The people who run the shops, who run the pubs and the restaurants, they all have a responsibility to make sure that the regulations are followed. So it was really clear that all of those responsibilities and all we were doing were things that legitimately should be done by the police and were being done in concert with all the other issues that we had to deal with. We've pushed really hard, not always successfully, to get consistent messaging and management of expectations out of government. that's been really challenging for us, because it's been very damaging to our efforts, where you've got different government ministers saying different things, answering questions and giving a slightly different perception. So the whole issue of communication has been really important, and managing people's expectation, not only about what is happening in society, but also what the police can and can't do. And then lastly is trying to get clear and unambiguous rule changes. In the UK, we have moved through phases of different restrictions done in different ways: national restrictions, more localized restrictions, different tiers of restriction. And all of that is really challenging for the public to understand. So we've pushed wherever we've had the opportunity to push, wherever we've had the opportunity to push to get clear and unambiguous rule changes, so that it was as easy for people to follow as it possibly could be. And we set ourselves a really straightforward way of operating, how we were going to deal with this, and this has stood the test of time for the last 10 months, and that is to operate against what we describe as the 4 E's. So in terms of the way that we were policing, and you saw a little bit of this in the Surrey video, we will engage with people. That is how we do policing in the United Kingdom. We talk to the public. We are amongst the public. We're not a body that's remote from the public. So we will engage with people. We will explain the regulations, because, as I say, they have changed. At times, the regulations have been different in different parts of the country. So we'll explain that, and we provided really clear guidance to our staff, so that they were able to share that guidance with the public. And if somebody was breaching a rule, at the point you engage with them and you explain it, they weren't wearing the mask, they were in a place they shouldn't be, they were in a group that was larger than it should be, then we would encourage them to comply. So give them the opportunity and say, you can now comply. If you put your mask on, you're okay to travel on this train. If you split this group up, you're okay to carry on in the number you are. And we would offer them that opportunity. And then, only as a last resort, we would consider enforcement. And the way enforcement has worked in the UK is by fixed penalty notices, so tickets that people have been given for varying amounts of fine, that then that person has to then go and pay and deal, or go to court if they want to challenge that ticket. But very, very clearly from the outset and throughout, we have adopted the 4 E's approach. Now, I have to say, as we've got to the later end and where we are now, where actually we've had throughout, the vast majority of the public have been sensible and responsible and have complied, but we have moved to enforcement in those areas where people are very deliberately and flagrantly breaching the rules, particularly about those people that are organising and bringing groups of people together in sort of social settings, which is obviously a mass spreading issue. So the 4 E's has stood us in really good stead throughout the policing of the pandemic. So what did we do to set up the response? So first of all, we set up a command structure end of February, beginning of March, using the gold, silver, bronze model that many of you will be familiar in terms of how we've operated. And as I say, I took on, from a national perspective, took on the gold role, and we set up a silver capability under an assistant chief constable who's been the silver throughout, with support from a number of others. And we identified those big areas that we needed to deal with, and we identified a senior police officer as the silver lead for those big areas. And I'll talk about those will become apparent as we work through. We had direct link into to the Home Secretary, so the equivalent of the Interior Ministry, to our Interior Minister, to the other ministers linked to policing and criminal justice, and also to the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Home Office. It was really important. This is about a medical emergency. It was really important to us that we understood what the committees, the medical committees were thinking, what their understanding of how the pandemic was developing was, and particularly through the Chief Scientific Advisor, we understood the issues around behavioural science. In every police force, all the police forces in the United Kingdom are legally independent. We do not have a national police service. We do not have a state police service. They are independent independent bodies. So I have run calls at very frequent intervals in a number of settings with all of our chief constables or groups of our chief constables. And we've done that. We've done gold calls where I've had the leads for our key areas on a weekly basis throughout the last 10 months. And our regional leads, each of our regions has a chief constable at any given point who is their sort of lead chief constable. And we started having those meetings on a weekly basis. Over the last couple of months, they've moved to 2 weekly basis. But lots and lots of communication with the leaders that were out in all of the forces. And in each of those forces, those leaders were creating a gold, silver, bronze structure in their own environment. We called our operation Talla, and we provided daily briefings, certainly for the first 6 or 7 months. We provided daily briefings that would go out on our system, which is called ChiefsNet, which goes out to all the different forces. So we were firing information out. At first, I think it was a bit overwhelming. We were trying to get a grip of the pandemic and the government's response, which was moving very, very fast at the beginning. And I think we probably overloaded people with the amount of information that was firing out. Gradually, that found itself a level, and we started to get into a place where it was operating much more effectively. And it has reduced in the kind of volume, but that's a means of getting stuff out and bringing it in. At a local level, all the forces were working in their local resilience forum. So the local resilience forum across the country, bringing together other public sector partners, third sector partners, to manage the operation at a local level. And that was really critical. At no point did I at the centre try and step in and take over, because those relationships have to work at that local level where people understand the local context, understand the capabilities, and develop those. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. We also then had a seat at both the gold and the silver level meetings being held by the Department of Health and Social Care. And that was really important for us to get into that group, so that each week we were able to look at all the data that talked about the spread of the pandemic across the United Kingdom, and it allowed us to anticipate where the government was likely to go in terms of restrictions in different places. So it's really important for us to get into that. The service delivery report was about us being able to produce documentation to talk about what was happening with crime and demand across the country, so that we had a national perspective on what was happening around crime and demand and how our policing of the pandemic and the pandemic itself was affecting that. And then lastly, ACRO, which is our criminal records office, who amazingly and very quickly set up a process to nationally manage all the fixed penalty notices, so the tickets that were being given out. And we started very quickly to get reports on a weekly basis from ACRO, so that we understood what the picture of the tickets were across the country. So we were then able to respond to questions that were happening at a national level. Forces obviously responded at a local level to their communities about the way they were policing, and it differed in different places because the pandemic issues presented themselves in a different way. But we needed a national picture that we were able to present. So what have been the real challenges? So coordination is a real challenge in a structure where you've got 43 plus forces across England, Wales, we've got Scotland, Northern Ireland, Transport Police, British Transport Police, and others, trying to bring that together. Also, government having to work simultaneously with the devolved administrations. So you have a Scottish government, you have a Welsh government, you have a Northern Ireland Assembly in the United Kingdom, government having to work with them, and obviously the police forces in those respective areas, not only working to the Westminster government and with us at the centre, but equally having at the same time to look and see and operate within the context of their own political arrangements, which created complexities. And we often had different regulations across the border. And in the second half, I guess, of where we've been so far, things started to differ regionally as well. So different parts of the United Kingdom were operating. And of course, a chief constable finds his or herself working not only with me at the centre and to the Westminster government, but also to their regional and their local governance, their police and crime commissioners or the mayor, whichever model we have in different areas. So that's always a challenge in policing. I think it's a challenge that was particularly amplified during the pandemic. The legislation and the guidance moved quickly. It often changed quickly, and often we didn't have enough time that we would have wanted to prepare our guidance to go out to police staff and police officers. And we had some real challenges fighting a bit with government to make sure that that was as effective as it could be. And on some occasions, we did not start policing a new regulation until we had got the guidance out. And we made that very clear with government. We weren't going to have our officers bounced into a situation where they didn't understand what they should be doing. Personal protective equipment, as it was for everybody, was a real challenge at the beginning, but I think we got into a system. We ran a national system, independent of the health systems, which was hugely successful, and I'm really proud of how we did that. But it was really hard at the beginning. And then the track and trace process here started to get us a challenge with the number of officers that were being identified as being at risk and were then having to self-isolate. Media throughout has been really challenging. This has been the only thing media have been talking about. They are always looking for a story that becomes sensational, and sometimes that was about policing action because they felt it was either over the top or it was too soft. Everyone on this call who's involved with policing will know that we can never win with the media, but that's been a real challenge for us to manage that and then manage what the politicians are saying in the media and others. In the midst of the pandemic, we had to deal with the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged across the world. That was challenging in its own right for a whole range of reasons that I won't have the time to talk about here. But of course, you're then talking about groups of people getting together to protest, to demonstrate at a time where we are equally have legislation that says that people should not be congregating in large numbers. And that put police leaders in really challenging situations to balance not only the rights of those individuals to protest, to balance the really important issues that Black Lives Matter is all about, and particularly in relation to policing, to balance the COVID restrictions and how we deal with that. All of that, as everyone who's involved in managing public order understands, is really challenging. I think really particularly difficult during these times. Her Majesty's government and number 10 Downing Street, where the Prime Minister is, has proved to be pretty challenging throughout. We have had to assert our independence about the way that we will do what we do, whilst at the same time playing a really full role in the way that we can play to help the country fight the pandemic. But it has been a challenging relationship with government. We've seen crime and demand shift. So in the first big lockdown, crime dropped away significantly by about 20, 28, 30%, as did demand. As you can imagine, no nighttime economy, no burglary because people were all in their homes. But some other things in and around digitally delivered crimes rose at the same time. So we've had all of that to deal with. The criminal justice system, the courts closed. They are slowly starting to get back. And this is one that really concerns me as we look forward. I think one of the real legacies of the pandemic from a policing and crime point of view is going to be the backlog that sits in the criminal justice system. And I do worry about where that will be and how we will deal with that going forward. And we're doing a lot of work with criminal justice partners to try and drive that. But I'm concerned about where we are with there. And those local resilience fora that I described, that's been really hard at a local level. Local resilience forum normally would be set up for something like flooding and maybe would sit for 3 weeks, 4 weeks at the most. And then everyone goes back and does what they do. Local resilience forums have now been sitting for 9 months continuously. They are also now dealing with all the responsibilities that will be there around EU exit and whatever that means for particular parts of the country. And they're now dealing with assisting around the rollout of the vaccinations. They are very tired. It's been very hard, and there's some real lessons that we've learned. But that is going to continue to be a real pressure. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do future-wise. So, what I think our achievements have been, and I think personally that policing has done a good job for the UK in terms of dealing with the pandemic. The personal protective equipment, as I say, we set up our own supply and distribution system. We worked with the military to borrow some space at a Royal Air Force air base, and we got some logistical assistance. And after a little problem at the beginning, we have had absolute availability of PPE for our staff, which has been really important for both their well-being and, importantly, their ability to get out and do their work. I think we set up our structure really quickly, and we thought ahead. We had foresight on a number of things. We didn't get it all right, but we had foresight on a number of things, and I think that was really good. But we set it up quickly, and we got up and running ahead of where we needed to be, and that's allowed us to respond and shift that as we've gone through. The National Police Chiefs Council, which is my organisation, and the National Police Co-ordination Centre have run that cross-cutting gold, silver command approach, which I think has worked really well. And we've been massively supported by staff from the College of Policing, who closed down a lot of their training, and by the Inspectorate, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, who again suspended their inspections, and they gave us staff that have filled some of those really key roles. I think establishing those principles about how we were going to do this at the beginning that I described earlier was really important. I think we have done a reasonable job around comms and media. It's not been perfect, but I think we've got ahead of it. We've done some strategic comms, we've shared information with people, and we've done enough in the media. But I've always been very minded not to make the police the story in the media. This is a health, an economic, and to a certain extent an education crisis. And I've been trying to balance our coverage to make sure it doesn't become about policing. I want policing to be there, doing our role professionally, getting on with what we do, carrying on our normal business of keeping people safe and engaging with communities. So we tried to manage that. As I say, whilst the relationship with Her Majesty's government has at times been tense and difficult, I think we have developed that relationship, and we've worked it, I think, in a way that has been beneficial for both sides. We have maintained our independence as policing, and we've done what we think is the right thing to do and in the way that we should do it. And we have at the same time been able to support government, and that has been challenging at times, but I think we've more or less got where we need to. And what has been recognised is we have responded as one UK police service. It has not been England or England and Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland. All of our police services has worked together as part of Operation Talla, and I think that's been really important to make sure that that everyone knows that we are all working to similar ways of operating, and that's been really important. And what I also think has been our achievement is the dedication, the commitment, and the resourcefulness of our staff has been extraordinary. Everybody has got into this. We've had very, very low levels of absence, and our staff have been there. And as we saw on that video, and as was mentioned, I think just then by Bob, you have police officers doing all sorts of roles, particularly through the local resilience forums, where it was really critical to get PPE out into care home settings or into other medical settings, where it was really important to be supporting those people who might be particularly vulnerable or isolated. Some of our staff have done amazing work in all of that. And at the same time, we've been keeping and dealing with all the criminality, which, whilst it had a little bit of a pause in some regard at the beginning, has carried on since then. So just to conclude, what I also set up fairly early on was a piece of work that sits within the overall Talla work around recovery and reform. We've got to get into a recovery phase, and I think we will start to properly get into a recovery phase probably in sort of February, March time next year, once the vaccine rollout has moved forward and we've gone through this current wave of infection. So that recovery work will be really key. But what is also key is reform. We've learned lots of lessons during the pandemic so far, and we will no doubt learn more over the coming months. And we must use those lessons to improve where we are. And I've just put some of the headings up there. So the governance issue, what should our relationship be with government at a national level, governance at a local level? What about how we do things from a national perspective, which we've been doing so much over the last 10 months? How much of that do we take forward? Where are the bits that are beneficial? Where are the bits that we don't want to carry forward? We've learned an awful lot about what we know or don't know about national level data. it's not been great, if I'm honest. We've got inconsistent data in all the different forces. So I think there's some real learning there. Setting up that national process around PPE has taught us lots of lessons about procurement, about supplies, about all of those kind of services that we provide into policing, and potentially ways to do them better, potentially ways to do them more economically. We've maintained training and recruitment throughout this process by becoming much more digital. We need to really grasp all of that. We've looked at training that hasn't happened. Does it need to start again? Do we need to do it in a different way? And our custody facilities, we have managed to maintain and keep going in a COVID friendly way. But again, lots of lessons. Partnerships through those local resilience work, through the national work, through the partnerships between forces. We've learned enormous lessons about how we can do those things better, where there are strengths, where there are weaknesses, and we need to kind of take that forward. Again, public engagement, I think we're pretty good at that, and it's something that's a bedrock of our service. However, we've learned lessons, we've done things in different ways. How do we take that forward? We've had to do that, whether it's public engagement or comms, we've had to do loads more digitally and remotely. We're learning lessons. If you take public engagement, people traditionally telephone the police in this country. That has stayed at a reasonable level, but we've seen a massive explosion in the number of people that digitally come to us online. And the systems that we were creating have grown exponentially in their use over this. That tells us things about how we can better engage with the public, and we need to learn those lessons. Communications I've spoken about quite a lot. Massive learning, as for every organisation, around workplace. What does workplace mean? We've had considerably more people working remotely, working from home, operating in very different ways. We are holding conferences like we're doing today in a completely digital way of operating. Our workforce have seen a different way of operating. They will be demanding different ways of operating that balance their work with their personal lives. And we're going to have to pick that up and take from it the good, take from it the opportunity, and it can bring different people to come and work for us when you suddenly realize you don't have to be in the same geographic space or the same building to contribute. So fascinating how that's going to work. And then I guess agility, really. What this has taught us, we are relatively slow turning organizations, and certainly if you look at policing as a whole, government as a whole, this pandemic has forced us to be agile. We have done things in a matter of days or weeks that would otherwise have taken us years to work through. In terms of getting agreement and getting things signed off. So that agility, we've got to harness some of that agility as we go forward. So I apologize that I've gone into the dark. We have an energy saving system in my office, and when I'm in here on my own, I need to keep moving around. So I will get it back on in a second, but I'll conclude there really, just to say I'm really proud of the response that we have managed in UK policing. Our relationship with our public is as strong, if not in some cases stronger. People have seen the role that we have tried to play to support this, but I think we have, and if I go back to those two words that were there from the Home Affairs Select Committee about policing what are extraordinary and unique powers with sensitivity and with diligence, I think that's what we are achieving. We are not at the finish line by any stretch of the imagination, but we're into a good rhythm and a good routine now. And with the support of all the chiefs from across the UK, we will continue to police in that way and hopefully start to see the UK and, of course, the rest of the world emerging out of this pandemic. So I will stop there and open up for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, our first question would be from Paul West. Paul, would you like to ask your question if you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, thanks very much, Karen, and good morning, Martin. Thanks ever so much for that presentation. Fantastic. It's really good that you can give us your time this morning. Really, really interesting presentation. Speaking as a former British Chief Constable myself, I chaired the Local Resilience Forum in West Mercia for 8 years, I think, and we did numerous pandemic flu exercises. Nobody ever thought of things like lockdown social distancing. None of that ever featured. So the way that the police service have had to react overnight has been quite remarkable, I think. So credit to all of you. My question really was specific to fixed penalty notices. In the earlier presentation from Daisy, I forget the figure, but it was tens of thousands of fixed penalties have been issued.
Yeah.
But she said that 60% remain unpaid. You yourself said you have concerns about the criminal justice system backlog.
Yeah.
So there's some real additional threats from that. But the other point was that rather than, police officers have been used to issuing fixed penalty notices for £60, perhaps £100. Suddenly, there was the power to issue fixed penalty notices for £10,000. I wonder what the NPCC view was of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Where we are at the moment, I think we're just over across the whole of the UK. It's about 25,000 or thereabouts. I don't know the latest number of fixed penalty notices that have been issued. You're quite right to say that it's sort of just under half that have at this point been paid. And that is a real challenge for the system. We have been working with government and the criminal justice process to find a way that doesn't mean that we clog all of the courts up. And some people have not felt that those tickets are a fair thing. They don't like the restrictions. So that will need to work its through. And we are really concerned about what that potentially means going into the system. Your point about the numbers is a really interesting one because, and I've had some we've had some quite challenging conversations about that because we have been concerned, as you say, police officers for some time have been used to a £60 ticket for speeding or whatever. When you're getting up to bigger numbers, the bigger numbers were put in place by the government to deal with with particularly organizational breaches. So businesses that were not undertaking their responsibility. And then also particularly the 10,000 was about people who organized large groups coming together. Because what we saw over the summer period was the kind of outbreak, because there was no hospitality working, the outbreak of unlicensed music events. And I know Andy Marsh is talking after me, and certainly in his force area in Avon and Somerset, they've had some of these events where you've had 700-800 people turning up. So those bigger tickets were there specifically to deal with the organisers. And I have to say, the threat and the deterrent threat of those tickets really did have an impact on that, which I think has been positive. But just something that I didn't mention specifically in my speech, one of the things we also set up early on to help keep us true was an ethics committee. So we created an ethics committee. It's chaired by the Bishop of Manchester. It has other religious figures. It has retired chief constables, retired HMIs. It has some academics, some ethicists, some criminologist academics, and a range of people. There's about 13 or 14 people who come together for us, and we will pose questions to them, and we have posed questions to them specifically about the fixed penalty notices, about particularly the higher level fixed penalty notices, and also an issue we had at an early stage around a suggestion that there was disproportionality in the way that the fixed penalty notices were being issued, disproportionately to people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So we have been on that, Paul. It is challenging. It's the government that will set those. We then have to work out how we deal with them. The 4Es has been important, but we have used our ethics committee as well, and obviously used our opportunity to interact directly with government on that.
Thanks very much, Martin. Thank you. And it's fascinating to hear about the ethics committee as well. Thanks again.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Paul. Lydia, would you like to unmute and ask your 2 questions? Lydia, would you like to ask your 2 questions, or we'll come back to you? Okay, we'll come back to Lydia. Rod Jarman, would you like to just put your question?
Thank you. Good morning, Martin.
Morning.
It's good to hear from you. I think one thing I picked up from your presentation was that there is a lot of new stuff that came in that's changed the way you've organised your role as chair of NPCC. What do you think the long-term implications for the policing organisation in the UK are as a result of this pandemic?
So I think what it has demonstrated is that there is a requirement, there is a benefit, should I say, for us to be able to nationally coordinate. As you will know, there's always been an attempt to do that. And, you know, we start from a position and we remain in a position where every force is entirely independent. But there are quite clearly situations where us being able to collaborate in as effective a way as we can is really important, not only and primarily to provide the best service to the public, but also to do it economically. Because the other point that I didn't make it explicitly in the presentation is, when we look at recovery and reform, we know where we are going is into a number of years where we are going to have significantly less money from a government perspective to fund public services. So we're now going back into a position, I think, whilst the word will never be used, we are potentially going into a period of austerity for the public sector just because of the financial impact that COVID will have had. So I think that drives an argument for greater coordination, greater ability to collaborate where that is positive. When I came into this job not quite 2 years ago, I already looked and felt that we needed to develop how the capability and the capacity of NPCC to do that coordination alongside the National Coordination Centre. So we're working on a programme of what that development might look like, and I'm waiting to hear whether that is going to be supported out of the spending review decision that was taken a couple of weeks ago, to just start to build our capability to be able to do some of these things nationally, bring together the knowledge from all the forces, and then be that point into government, because that's really the primary role that I've played over the last 9 months, is being the services, or the leadership of the services, point directly into government on a day-to-day basis. And that, I think, has been very beneficial in this regard, because you simply can't do it with 50 voices coming in. Of course, you know, government have linked into all sorts of other forces, but you do need somewhere where you're bringing together an understanding of what the real issues are, understanding of what the opportunities are, how we're going to do it, and being able to speak coherently. So I think it has put pressure onto that, which hopefully, I think, has convinced people that this is beneficial to have some greater capacity and capability at the centre, but not in any way stepping into the space, which quite rightly is each force is independent and has their own police and crime commissioner or mayor. But I think we've had a good chance over the last 10 months to practice how you can make that work in a beneficial way and not in an overburdensome way. And whenever it has got slightly overburdensome, as you might imagine, the chiefs have been fairly quick to come back and let me know, and we've been able to kind of adjust what we're doing.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, sir. I'll just try Lydia one more
great,
time.
I think the one thing that I've seen from
questions. No. Okay. One last question then from Abigail. Really interesting what you said about clarity of responsibility in enforcing rules, including that it's the responsibility of members of the public, shop owners, bus drivers, etc. to do so. Can you comment on public engagement when policing one another, how well this has worked? Have these encounters between members of the public escalated when, for example, a member of the public tries to enforce rules following on another? That's Abigail.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing has been about behaviour, really, and that's what we've started. We were very clear at the beginning that there is no way, and we managed to get government to agree at the beginning. This had to be based on what you would describe as a consensus model, i.e., we all agree that this is the right thing to do. We've got to do something to stop the spread of the virus, rather than a compliance model where you've got someone kind of pointing the finger. So that's the approach we've taken. We had a group, one of our silver groups was specifically working, for example, with the retail trade. So all the people that run, particularly the big supermarkets that were open all the way through, to work with them about how can they play their part. Because look, let's be perfectly honest, the person who goes to work every day to work in Sainsbury's, the shop Sainsbury's, does not expect to be in confrontation with with customers and members of the public. That's not what they're there for. But we needed to work, how can we get everybody to play their part? We have had at various points when the rules have changed, we've seen high levels of demand with people phoning in or coming in online to say, my neighbour's breaking the rules and all of that side of things. So that's been at times quite challenging for us and to some extent a little disappointing. But I think generally people have understood the reasons, and that's been really what I've been trying to push into government, is saying, yeah, the rules, we need the regulations, but the key bit here is explaining to people. And I think if you look back at the UK in the early stages where they were having those podium briefings every day at number 10 Downing Street, and every day we got the number of people that have contracted the disease and the number that have died, it was very much in the forefront of people's minds. I think once that stopped, and once we started having different rules in different places, and I think psychologically, once people weren't, people weren't seeing the number of deaths on a daily basis, and they were seeing an encouragement to go out now and go shopping, go out and do this, that balance between health and economy, it starts to get quite conflicted in people's minds, I think. And that's where we've kind of come in. That's why the explain element of our 4Es has been so critical, because we can be a group of people out on the ground with some authority, but more importantly, trusted by the public and with some knowledge to try and explain. So it's been difficult. There obviously have been occasions where we've ended up having to deal with people who've got, where there's been irritation and in some case, little bits of, assaults and so on. But on the whole, despite the media's best effort to constantly portray the worst case scenario, I actually think the British public have responded pretty sensibly, because it absolutely starts with individual responsibility. I've got to be responsible about the impact I can have as an individual. Then you look about your responsibility within your family, within your workplace, and if you've got a profession that's involved within your profession. But we've never been in a place that's expected, train conductors to be kind of rolling around arguing with people. They will do their engage, they will do their explain, and if people refuse, then they'll call the police, and that's where it comes into our role and our responsibility.
Martin, hopefully I'm back online. I do apologise for dropping out entirely the wrong times. And when I come back in, I'd lost all the questions. Martin, can I just thank you? That was a fascinating insight into how the UK police have coped with this, as you say, unprecedented pandemic. Take it from me, the response of police officers up and down the country has been fantastic, which is in no small part due to you and your efforts. You talk about people being exhausted. I don't know how you're coping, managing everything that you've talked about today. So on behalf of everybody, Martin, thanks not just for taking the time to come and speak to us today, but for everything you've done in the UK for keeping us through this really challenging year. Huge thanks to you, Martin, and hopefully I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Bob.